You're listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. Before I get into the episode, I just want to take a minute to express my infinite gratitude to each of you who have shown so much support and encouragement and care throughout this really big change. I just can't even describe what it feels like to see so much positivity and support and well wishes to us both. I may or may not have cried a few happy tears. So I just want to say thank you. And I'm beyond excited to bring you all some fun and nerdy and creative tarot and mental health content. So let's get into the episode. So today we are going to journey through the realm of resilience with the Fool. Cultivating Resilience has been on my to talk about list for a while now. Plus, I've really been wanting to do some deep dives into specific cards on the podcast. And, in light of recent changes, it just seemed like it was the perfect time to take that leap. And what better way, even if it's mildly cliche, to start with the Fool. But in the beginning of this year, we had a theme in the symposium, which was playing the Fool. And I challenged myself to spend the whole month just reflecting on the archetype of the Fool. I was journaling just randomly, not even anything structured. Just anytime I had a thought or idea or read something that made me think about the Fool in a different way, I wrote it down. And I was reading a lot of different material and peeling back any layer that I feel like I could find with the Fool until I had gotten to this point where I was somewhat satisfied, or at least until I felt like I had reached a little bit of depth, because I always struggled with finding meaning beyond surface level when it came to the Fool. And I definitely don't feel like I know everything there is to know about the Fool right now. But I feel like I've reached this point where I'm like, okay, I'm beyond surface level with the Fool. I guess it's kind of like, when you're wading into a pool or some other body of water, a lake, the beach, and eventually you reach that point where you're right on your tippy toes and you have to start moving your arms around to make you stay upright. I feel like that's what I was searching for with the Fool, because it always felt like I was stuck in the shallow end. I could walk in and it was safe to just kind of wait around. And, that's perfect for when you're a kid or you're just learning how to swim, but it gets pretty boring after a while. So it was during this month-long journey with the Fool that I realized that this archetype is actually way deeper than I've ever given it credit for. And I feel like it actually kind of represents the paradox of our human experience, like the tension we feel between craving order amidst inevitable chaos, or the search to find balance between our desire for logic and reasoning and also our inescapable emotional landscape that we live in, or our need to differentiate between pings of excitement versus waves of anxiety, or the lifelong struggle of seeking to understand healthy versus unhealthy attachment and detachment. So those are kind of the four main pillars of depth that I've started to explore with the Fool. And I'm excited to just kind of share my thoughts with all of you and just where I'm at with the Fool. And if any of you have even more insight to provide on this, please reach out to me, because this is definitely a card that I have avoided or just ignored. And so it's been fun to really just dive in and figure out what else I can discover. Something that I realized about the Fool, and maybe the reason why it's always felt a little shallow to me, is because it's really the ultimate card of ambiguity. The only certainty that this card offers us is uncertainty. Plus, layered within the shadows of the archetype is the universal experience of anxiety, one none of us are fans of. So it's really this hot and cold card that when I see it, I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to set that over here. But, even despite it being an archetype of ambiguity, which ambiguity is the foundation upon which anxiety is built, the card is also really playful and beautiful and courageous. So there really ends up being quite a bit to learn from the Fool, especially in regards to this idea of cultivating resilience, even though it can sometimes feel one-dimensional still, but I'm working on it. So I want to expand a little bit on the ideas I mentioned a moment ago, but first I want to start with the idea of ambiguity and the tension that we often feel between craving a sense of order in our life, even though life is naturally chaotic. I feel like the Fool reminds us that our sense of security, our sense of stability, or even our sense of identity is fluid. It's an archetype of constant change, both around and within us. And the Fool doesn't offer us this fixed point of reference, even though as humans, we crave that. That sense of stability and security can be really elusive. And when we do come across little bits of that, we end up having that sigh of relief, like, oh, okay, I found it. And then, of course, cue minor or major tower moment, because that's inevitable. And then we just repeat the cycle, like seeking out those pillars of stability and safety and security. And then something happens to demolish it. And then we're trying to find it again. But what's interesting is that reality doesn't seem to have any sort of effect on the Fool. They are totally unbothered and they continue on anyway. And I think it's important to make a clear distinction here because often this card is attributed to being naive. But I think that's an attribute that maybe belongs to just the shadow of the card. I don't know. I'm still reflecting on that. Some people might disagree, and that's okay. But I think as a whole, this archetype really understands they're constantly in a state of flux between that order and chaos, and yet they choose to exist alongside of it. And I feel like there's a real sense of wisdom and resilience just within that. I almost want to liken it to the concept of radical acceptance, a concept we've explored at length on the podcast and on Instagram. And it's this concept and idea that exists within dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT for short. But I feel like I want to kind of merge radical acceptance with the Buddhist principle of non-attachment, because to practice both radical acceptance and non-attachment is to fully and completely accept our present experience without any sort of judgment or resistance. It involves acknowledging and embracing both the good and the bad, the pleasant, the unpleasant, the joyful and the non-joyful aspects of our life. This includes not just experiences, but our emotions, our thoughts, and just our circumstances. Both of these concepts recognize that suffering is an unavoidable part of life, and that by attempting to escape or deny or avoid or ignore that ultimately only leads to further distress. Whereas when we let go of the resistance and avoidance, that's when we can fully be present in the moment and truly experience our life as it is and as it unfolds. So this brings me to another idea that the Fool archetype is also the personification of liminal energy. And liminality is basically the state where one is not yet something, but also not nothing. We can honestly think of that as being the space in between order and chaos, kind of how we feel right after a tower moment. We might feel like we have nothing or that we are nothing. But the truth is, we still exist and the world around us still exists, but we aren't what we were before the tower moment, but we're also not quite what we will be after the tower moment. A good way to think about this concept is through metaphor. And if you've been listening for a while, you know that I love a good nature or garden metaphor. So here we go. When I lived in Florida, I used to grow a ton of milkweed, and I would get absurdly excited when the caterpillars would come to feast because I knew that eventually I would have this trove of butterflies flying around the yard, and it would just be super magical. I feel like we can apply the concept of liminal energy to that experience. So think about how a caterpillar emerges from its cocoon. This is the caterpillar's old state. But before they fully change into a butterfly, which would be its new state, there ends up being this really important stage where their wings aren't entirely developed. So they're not a butterfly, but they're also not a butterfly. But it's like during this time, the butterfly has to grab onto a plant stem or some other support structure in order to stabilize. And basically, it's just patiently waiting for the wings to fully develop. It's the ultimate hurry up and wait stage. And it's really a stage of like uneasiness and vulnerability, sometimes confusion, like, what am I supposed to do with myself? I'm just kind of like hanging out. But it's a perfect example of liminal energy. And it kind of reminds me of the concept of healthy versus unhealthy attachment and detachment, because within this liminal experience is an invitation to let go of our attachments, let go of our expectations and our preconceptions, and instead embrace the true mystery and ambiguity and the constant back and forth oscillation of life, and also our identities and just the experience of being human. I feel like that's what cultivating resilience really feels like. It's accepting the awkwardness of the human experience, the awkwardness of, I've just emerged from this cocoon and my wings aren't fully developed. So I kind of just have to hang out here and wait. It's like, okay, now what? And this experience really requires a lot of vulnerability, because the reality is we are always weaving in and out of states of familiarity and comfort and into states of newness and discomfort. And none of us can predict how long those shifts will take, how drastic a change will occur when it's complete. So it's really important to be gentle and compassionate with not only ourselves, but the people around us, because the people around us are experiencing the exact same thing. And sometimes that's easy to forget because we get so wrapped up in our own lives and our own experiences. And when we can be compassionate and curious about the stages of our journey and the journey of others, that's when we really start to cultivate a sense of resilience. Now, just because the Fool is this card of ambiguity and liminality, that doesn't mean that we are stuck or that we don't have free will or the ability to make choices that impact our life, our experiences, or our future. In fact, the Fool's journey itself starts with a choice, this intentional decision to step out of the known, or maybe even outside of a comfort zone and into the unknown. The Fool reminds us that we always have a choice in the direction that our path will take, or at least how we engage with our path. And I want to be gentle there because there's a real privilege that exists to even say that. And I feel like we need to acknowledge privilege and circumstance right now, because sometimes we are powerless over a situation, and it's not as simple as just deciding to change our life. There are consequences, or maybe we can't just decide to change our life. However, the Fool does show us that we have the ability to at least alter the way that we engage with what's happening to us or what's in front of us. And this is where I lean in on the idea of self-compassion and curiosity as almost the ultimate pillars of resilience, especially when we're powerless over a situation, because we can at least experiment with how are we existing within this space that we cannot control. So, for example, curiosity might look like a bit of self-analysis, asking, what is it that I'm paying most attention to right now? How is that serving me? What is it that you're neglecting by only paying attention to this one area? How would your life be different if you shifted your focus to a different area? Or who are you paying most attention to? And what is it about that person that demands so much of your focus? All of these questions are rooted in the idea of cultivating resilience. Another way to view the Fool archetype within the realm of resilience, and this might be my new favorite, is as a zealous collector of experiences, identities, and journeys. There's a strength in the Fool's non-attachment in which their willingness to explore often prevents them from that what if cognitive loop of anxiety that so many of us get stuck in. And I feel like this is where the experience of learning how to differentiate between our pings of excitement versus waves of anxiety come into play. And as I mentioned before, the Fool is an archetype of ambiguity, and ambiguity is the building block of anxiety. However, this archetype uses ambiguity as fuel for resilience and adventure. There's this inherent spontaneity that gives them the ability to walk right up to the cliff's edge without a second thought, despite not knowing what lies ahead. That's something that doesn't come naturally to the majority of us. We might find that we've denied ourselves the opportunity to truly take in how beautiful that view must be from the cliff's edge because we're caught up in the anxious thought loop of, what if? What if I fall? What if the cliff's edge crumbles beneath me? What if the dog gets too excited and jumps on me and I lose my balance and then I tumble off the edge and then the dog comes with me? These anxious thoughts are the shadow components of the Fool, and I'm sure I could keep going with what ifs. I'm great at it, just as I'm sure a lot of you are. But, even though that what if loop exists within the shadow of the Fool, it's not all consuming because going back to radical acceptance, they've been able to radically accept that that part of their existence is there. And they've learned how to exist alongside it, which gives room for their excitement of, oh my gosh, how beautiful the view is going to be when I walk up to that cliff's edge, where a lot of us might get stuck in the what if loop and not give ourselves the opportunity to also say, but I can't wait to see how beautiful it is. I think it's this willingness to move forward despite a possible fall that allows the Fool to end up as one of the wisest and most resilient archetypes in the tarot. And I think it's a wisdom and a resilience that we don't give the Fool credit for. Speaking of wisdom, this reminds me of another concept within DBT called the wise mind. And apparently I really like the relationship between the Fool and DBT, but the idea behind the wise mind is that we have an emotional mind, a rational mind, and a wise mind. You can think of this as like a Venn diagram with the emotional and rational minds on either side of the wise mind and overlapping in the middle. I've used this concept as inspiration for tarot spreads, and you can find it on Instagram. I share it pretty often because it's one of my favorites. It's an easy go-to. But I had pulled this spread for myself a while back, and I ended up drawing the Fool in the position of the wise mind. And at first, I was totally taken aback. I was like, absolutely not. Because at this point in my understanding of the Fool, I never would have willingly chosen this archetype to represent the wise mind. But then I was reflecting and contemplating its role and ability to exist within the wise mind. And I realized that, wait, hold on, the Fool is actually this collector of experiences who welcomes in every new life journey and identity with open arms. Their ability to continue moving forward despite any inevitable obstacles they encounter is actually quite admirable. And I feel like it's the collection of these experiences and navigating those obstacles that end up imparting the gift of wisdom upon the Fool. And I mean, if that's not the epitome of resilience, I'm not sure what is. Often we view the Fool only as this card or archetype that represents forward movement, new beginnings, or spontaneity. But now I wonder if it's not so much all of that as it is more about a lack of attachment or the act of embracing detachment. There's a lot of good reading on the Buddhist principle of detachment that could be helpful here, but I want to focus on the psychological and emotional realm of attachment versus detachment. We can observe that the Fool has trust in the journey that lies ahead and is prepared to descend from the cliff or at least stand there without hesitation or any sort of attachment to the end result. And that gives us this essence of lack of attachment to those thoughts that we were talking about earlier. When we are free of any sort of attachment, our capacity for fear, which is usually what keeps us from living authentically, is greatly reduced. And then if we take a closer look at some of the symbology in the Fool, this concept of detachment is just plastered all over the card. We see that they're happily carrying this bag at the end of a branch or a stick. The bag could have lots of different meanings, but following along the theory of attachment, it seems that the bag is this holder of past Fool experiences. The Fool understands that these experiences belong to them, but they do not rule or control their life or decisions. We know this because you can see that the bag isn't directly on the Fool's body, but held by a branch just off the body. So it's there, they can reach it, they can dig through it if they need to, but it's not attached to their person. In fact, the Fool could just drop this baggage at any time, but they choose not to. There's this appropriate distance between themselves and the bag. And I feel like that's the personification of healthy attachment or detachment. The more we venture into the world of attachment and detachment with the Fool, I think it's safe to say that we are discovering that it represents a secure attachment. Because when someone feels comfortable and secure in a relationship or with themselves, they feel at ease with both closeness and independence. This is clearly represented in the relationship the Fool has with their dog and their environment. The Fool trusts that the dog will follow, or at least still be there when they turn around because there's no leash and the Fool's not holding the dog. And the Fool trusts their surroundings and themselves enough to walk right up to the cliff's edge without hesitation. Secure attachment is also represented by our willingness to explore our surroundings freely and enthusiastically, but also maybe with some cautious curiosity. The shadow of this card could represent an insecure or anxious attachment, needing to try to figure out the outcome before it happens, constantly looking back to see if the dog is there, maybe having the bag closer to you, maybe carrying the dog, maybe leaning your body forward so as to try and peek over the edge, but try to keep the rest of your body on more solid ground. It would be spending all that time searching for the what ifs. And I don't want to spend too much time on attachment because I actually have some plans to explore this concept more in depth with some of the court cards that I'm pretty excited about. But I think the Fool represents healthy attachment. And I'm curious if anyone has anything that they want to say that expands upon that or maybe disagrees with it, please share. I'm totally excited to hear some other viewpoints. I think one of the most powerful things I've discovered during my time reflecting on the Fool and how it relates to this concept of resilience is the energy of the Fool and the Fool's ability to not just tolerate any sort of discomfort, but actually feel safe, both walking alongside of it and then moving away from it. We don't often realize that we perpetuate behavioral patterns and stay rooted in the same place, even when we're uncomfortable, simply because it feels familiar. And because we usually equate familiarity with safety, mainly because when something is familiar, that means it's easier for us to predict an outcome. So we end up stuck in a cycle we don't like simply because we know how to exist within it. Whereas the Fools learn that even though they're not able to predict the outcome for their next move, they trust themselves enough to know that it's safe to continue on anyway. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok under the handle @TheTarotDiagnosis and join us while we pull daily cards and explore tarot and mental health in between podcast episodes. You can also subscribe to our podcast to make sure that you never miss an episode. If you have a topic or question that you'd like for us to explore on the podcast, you can contact us directly on our website, www.thetarotdiagnosis.com.